My name is Matthew Chrisman. I teach philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, and today I want to talk to you about civil disobedience. Sometimes people break the law in protest of a particular law or governmental policy. When such disobedience of the law nonetheless manifests respect for the overall rule of law, it is often known as civil disobedience. For example, Rosa Parks broke Chapter 6, Section 11 of the Montgomery City Code about obeying a bus driver. She did so in protest of that and other Jim Crow-era laws. But she did not challenge the overall legitimacy of the legal system or call for an overthrow of the government. This is how a law-breaking action can still manifest respect for the rule of law. The concept of civil disobedience raises two interesting philosophical questions. How could an act simultaneously break a law and manifest respect for the rule of law? Is there a way to distinguish permissible and impermissible acts of civil disobedience? The classic liberal answer to these questions was most famously articulated by John Rawls. He characterized civil disobedience as an action done in a liberal democratic society with the aim of improving the terms of mutual cooperation within the society. Democracies are characterized by majority rule, and when all goes well, majority rule produces both stability and legitimacy for the law. In political philosophy, such systems of government are said to be liberal to the extent that they protect the rights and liberties of individuals, even when these conflict with what the majority wants. Rawls thought that, even when all is going well in a liberal democracy, civil disobedience might sometimes be necessary for improving the law's protection of individuals' rights and liberties. This is because the majority doesn't always recognize the way in which particular laws infringe on individuals' rights, especially those of various minorities. When this happens, defenders of those rights should first engage in legal means of securing recognition and rectification of rights violations. They should make speeches, sign petitions, lobby their political representatives, organize marches, etc. However, when such means fail, liberals think it is sometimes permissible to break the law in conscientious protest. For doing so could be the most civil option remaining for bringing one's society to recognize and rectify significant and systematic rights violations. As Rawls writes, by acting in this way, one addresses the sense of justice in the majority of the community and declares that in one's considered opinion, the principles of social cooperation are not being respected. His point is that in protesting in this way, one breaks a law, but one does so with the conscientious aim of improving the law. In this way, we could see Rosa Parks' illegal protest on the bus in Montgomery as aiming to get the government to improve the laws by making them more just. She broke a law with the conscientious aim of improving the law. Not all possible acts of civil disobedience are permissible, however. One could break a law with the conscientious aim of improving the law, but still go too far. Accordingly, liberals have attempted to identify various limits on the permissibility of civil disobedience. For instance, Rawls argues that acts of civil disobedience must be properly designed to make an effective appeal to the wider community, and he claims that there are various ways a protest could undermine this communicative function. This is his reason for insisting that civil disobedience be nonviolent. It also motivates his view that those engaged in civil disobedience should respect private property, submit openly to arrest, act in coordination with other oppressed groups, and ensure they don't undermine the stability of the overall rule of law. These are the sorts of considerations a liberal would appeal to in distinguishing permissible from impermissible acts of civil disobedience. Two important objections motivate other views about civil disobedience. First, some philosophers argue that the liberal view is too narrow to capture all plausible cases of civil disobedience. Second, other philosophers argue that the liberal view is too idealized to make sense of the role of civil disobedience in many real-world political circumstances. Consider the first objection. Is the liberal view too narrow? By focusing on the question of rights violations, the liberal view ignores other reasons that might motivate and legitimate acts of civil disobedience. For example, lax environmental regulations or free trade laws. These policies are sometimes made for expedient reasons that favor particular interest groups without much reflection on long-range effects on people in other countries, future generations, animals, and the atmosphere. Nevertheless, it might not be obvious that anyone's rights are violated by specific regulations or laws in these areas. And yet a protester might see an urgent need to draw attention to these issues, where breaking a law in protest is the most civil way to get a majority decision reconsidered quickly and effectively. Consider the second objection. Is the liberal view too idealized? Rawls famously casts civil disobedience as an address to the sense of justice of the majority of the community, and he appeals to this communicative function in identifying limits on the permissibility of various acts of civil disobedience. In many real-world political circumstances, however, The majority of one's community holds views that are racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, etc. And this often means that appeal to the majority's sense of justice simply won't get them to recognize the validity of one's protest. Moreover, by limiting the means of permissible civil disobedience to ones which will effectively appeal to the wider community, it can seem that liberals such as Rawls put the onus on the oppressed to modulate their ways of communicating, rather than demanding that the majority be better at listening to the concerns of the minority. Accordingly, some philosophers have argued that we should revise Rawls's view of the communicative function of civil disobedience to make it more appropriate for real-world circumstances. They think we should allow for principled disobedience, which is civil, but not necessarily an attempt to convince the majority. Others have argued that we should recognize, alongside civil disobedience, a category of permissible uncivil disobedience for the many real-world circumstances where civil disobedience doesn't go far enough. In summary, civil disobedience is a kind of conscientious and principled lawbreaking. It is done in order to protest some law, policy, or collective decision. The liberal view of civil disobedience treats it as an attempt to rectify rights violations that occur in the context of majority rule. On this view, one breaks the law in protest, but one does so with the conscientious aim of improving the law by convincing one's fellow citizens that it is unjust. Other views about civil disobedience have been developed in response to the objection that the liberal view is too narrow and the objection that it's too idealized.